view that the Chinese have of the United States is that eventually the United States will turn on China and attack it and try to suppress it. And they thought that there was a window of opportunity for China to develop, to grow, so that it would be able to withstand the onslaught when it came. And I think they have good reason to think that this is the way that the United States will behave and the way that hegemonic powers often behave.
Welcome to the new Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Lee Jones, who is professor of political economy and international relations at Queen Mary University of London. He's the co-author, along with Shahar Hamiri, of Fractured China, an excellent book published in 2021. He's also a podcaster, a fellow podcaster of the excellent BungaCast, where he is an associate editor. Lee, welcome to the new Enlightenment.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I've been wanting to speak with you for a while about your work in relation to China. And the question I have for you is, how do you interpret China's current approach to global power? Are we witnessing a deliberate push for hegemony or something more defensive and reactive?
Well, I think, as you will know, this question is highly contested, obviously in the policy world, but also among China watchers. There are, I think it's fair to say the bulk of China watchers tend to think that China is mostly quite defensive and predominantly status quo oriented, actually quite a conservative power in many ways. And then there's a minority that tend to think of it as being quite hawkish and revisionist. And it's obviously those people that get the ear in Washington. My own view is that it's a bit tricky to talk about what China wants, because China is not a single hegemonic entity. It's not just some big lump that, despite an authoritarian regime, thinks in this single-minded way. What Fractured China was about was trying to unpack the Chinese party state and say, look, there are these different interest groups within it. They compete, they contest for power, and how does that actually shape China's global engagement, so that it's a lot less coherent and top-down and micromanaged than we think in the West. But broadly, if you pushed me and said, well, okay, fine, but in the aggregate then, what's the Chinese view? I think I would side with David Kang and colleagues who wrote an excellent piece recently in the journal International Security entitled "What Does China Want?" And they look at Chinese policy discourse internationally and domestically and try to map, what is it that China actually wants? And this, I think, aligns broadly with my view, which is that the Chinese government sees itself mostly as defensive and as reacting to US pressure and aggression. And I think it does have good reasons to think that this is the case. We might get onto that a bit later on. I think China suffers, as all great powers do, from great power autism. It's unable to see the way that its actions are perceived externally and its own role in bringing about American aggressiveness or American assertiveness, particularly since the first Trump administration. It looks at itself as so sort of enlightened and peaceful. It's unable to see how its own assertiveness in the South China Sea from 2009 is interpreted by others. It doesn't think that anybody should poke its nose into places like Hong Kong or Xinjiang, where there's been significant crackdowns and repression. It's nobody else's business. It doesn't have any implications for the way that China should be viewed internationally. And I think, obviously, China has become a bit more assertive and globally present under Xi Jinping since 2013 with the launch of things like the Beltandroadinitiative. But I think, broadly speaking, the Chinese regime wants a stable and permissive international environment for the pursuit of the regime's own goals, which are to maintain itself, which largely means to continue to pursue economic development and to escape the middle income trap right now. And it wants broad deference to Chinese interests, especially in its near abroad. So it wants a secure perimeter, which again is what all big powers want, right? They want friendly states on its borders. They want to push away threatening other big powers, in particular the United States. They want the United States to be pushed back away from the Chinese coastline. But I think it's very clear that China does not want to be a global hegemon, and also it cannot replace the United States as the global hegemon. It does not have the hard power or soft power resources to be able to step in from what the United States is stepping back from.
No, I think that's what you said is largely my understanding and my observation of China, both China and its actions abroad, but also in China itself. And I say that having just been there the last week. Now, I think it's interesting what you say about this kind of great power autism, if you like, that it doesn't actually perceive why there might be a reaction to its behavior. In part, so much of the narrative around China going out and going global is it's always a win-win. So let's take China and Africa, for example, is that they think they're bringing development and opportunity and capital to Africa. And in many instances, they are. They're building infrastructure, they're building factories, they're creating jobs, and they seem to think it's always a win-win. But and that's their intent. But there's a difference between intent and outcome. You can see that about China around the world. So like you say,
Absolutely.
it doesn't want to be a hegemon, but it is a large economic force with activities all around the world, and that can't be ignored.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even in China's near abroad, these problems manifest. So I've spent a lot of time looking at China-Myanmar relations, for example, right? These two countries share a 2,000-kilometer border, and Chinese enterprises, Chinese local governments along the border, various Chinese agencies, millions of Chinese citizens have been interacting with Myanmar for 2 to 3 decades now, since the reform and opening up agenda reopened the border to cross-border interactions, and the central government started to encourage these kinds of transboundary interactions to develop Yunnan province. So what we see with the Belt and Road Initiative started much earlier, in fact, with attempts to develop China's inland provinces by encouraging them to start building these international ties. And a lot of really dodgy stuff happened under that very permissive policy, because this is broadly how the Chinese party state works, is that the central leaders set a broad direction of travel, but it's often really vague and capacious. It's slogans like Great Western Development or One Belt, One Road or win-win cooperation. If you read the top speeches of senior leaders, you will often think, what on earth does this mean? And you'll wonder, is this just because the translation software that I'm using is really bad? But no, Chinese people are also very confused. What do the top leaders mean when they say ABC? And it's up to others, enterprises, public and private and hybrid, government agencies in different sectors and at different territorial scales, right? Local governments in China are very powerful and quasi-autonomous, and also individual private citizens to interpret what that means and maybe, rework and interpret those guidelines according to their own interests, and even ignore those guidelines in pursuit of their own self-interest. And all kinds of things go wrong. And then when there's blowback, the Chinese system tends to sort of not want to look at its own conduct too closely. And there is a temptation to view everything through the prism of the rivalry with the United States. And this was true even as early as 2011, when there was the suspension of the Myitsone Dam in neighboring Myanmar. Right? The reaction then was, oh, this is just the United States. They've whipped up all of these civil society organizations against us because it's part of their great game to, needle us in our backyard. And that really wasn't what was going on at all. But that's what I mean by great power autism. And it is quite remarkable for a country of China's scale how few domestic experts there are on all these different countries where the Chinese are engaging. They are trying to change that by investing very heavily in area studies and language training and so on. And as you can imagine, when the Chinese start doing anything and throwing resources at it, they do make rapid progress. But they are learning from a very low base. They're quick learners, but they're learning from a low base. And so they're constantly, they are reflecting on their own conduct, but they're very unwilling to admit fault. And they're quicker to externalize it and blame others. And that's what I mean by great power autism. It is not unique to China.
No.
But they're definitely guilty of it.
It's a bit of a kind of a Soviet holdover, right? So much of Soviet in the sense of, if you think of, post-1949 and the influence of Stalinism in China, or let's say the reaction of the Soviets to everything is it's an American conspiracy to scupper.
But I would... Maybe, but I would flip that around and say that the American response to everything in the Cold War was, this is a Soviet. How they got dragged into so many hot wars in the global South was viewing everything through the prism, the rival with the Soviets. And I think increasingly that's happening now with the Chinese, is nothing that China does could possibly be seen as positive or even neutral, right? It's just viewed as a malign actor. And so if something bad is happening in country X, some malign interference by Russia or China must be at fault. And there is no capacity, I think, at all in the West to reflect on the way that Western policy over the past 20, 30 years has created the disorderly world that we now inhabit. Like, there's a desire to externalize it and put all the blame onto the so-called revisionist powers, when in fact I would say one of the most revisionist powers on the planet over the past 30 years has been the United States.
Well, we'll come back to that, but I first want to go to the party state in China, in part because I think it was really interesting how you started to unpack how it works. And why I think that's important to unpack is the assumption from the outside that China is very top-down, very directive. It's a state capitalist power, right? We can't say that it's communist or socialist by any means, but there's a presumption, particularly in the West, and this is mobilized in the West by both policy figures, but also the financial press, that China is driven by this state capitalist logic, by this top-down, directive-oriented form of development. But what you've said, though, is actually, it seems to be that there's a lot of autonomy and, if you like, a kind of almost a market mechanism of different actors. And that's how markets are supposed to work, kind of figuring out and looking for different signals. They might not be always price signals, but they're signals from other actors in terms of what are we supposed to do? How do we do it? And that creates a certain sense of dynamism.
Right.
Is that an accurate perception of how things work? And can you dig deep a bit further in how the Chinese state operates? Because I think listeners would really benefit from understanding that.
The model that we developed in Fractured China and we've used in our work over the past 12 years, and we continue to use it, is that what has emerged since the reform and opening up period started to transition from Maoist communism towards what China is today, which I think I would agree with you is kind of broadly state capitalist, is a Chinese-style regulatory state. So that a regulatory state is distinguished from a kind of command and control state where the state intervenes directly to secure the outcomes that it wants by setting clear objectives, clear targets, and mobilizing resources and issuing direct orders to everybody to do these kind of things. The kind of systems of command and control and resource mobilization, which were repurposed for peacetime after the Second World War. Now, broadly across the world, those states have been dismantled, reformed from the 1970s onwards in line with globalization. And what you've got instead is a state that seeks to govern in a more kind of hands-off kind of way that sets broad objectives, broad directions of travel and regulatory frameworks, and then allows considerable autonomy for state, private and hybrid actors to work out what that should mean in practice. And so the state moves from a kind of command and control mechanism to a steering mechanism. And in China, why is it a Chinese-style regulatory state? The Chinese party state has a number of steering institutions that don't exist. They don't look like Western institutions. So the Communist Party is the most important steering institution because they have the powers of appointment, appraisal, and discipline for cadres. And that provides a significant amount of cohesion through a party state that has become fractured. Through the process of reform, there's been significant fragmentation of state power and resources. So they've spread sort of, if you like, horizontally across dozens of different state agencies and regulatory bodies. There's been decentralization. A lot of power and control over resources have been delegated down to the provincial and sub-provincial level. And then there's also been the internationalization of Chinese party state apparatuses. The obvious one is state-owned enterprises going global, but also other institutions created purely for domestic purposes acquiring an international role, such as Coast Guard agencies or the Ministry of Public Security, for example, overseeing counter-piracy operations on the Mekong. So those steering mechanisms are designed to shape and shove this more fractured party state towards desired ends, and along with the party mechanisms, you've got things like funding, legislation, and so on. But none of these things produce total centralized, top-down micromanagement of all the different party state actors, because those party state actors can respond to these steering mechanisms in three ways. They can influence them. They often involved in lobbying for certain kinds of rules, certain kinds of policies. They often sit on the coordinating bodies that are supposed to actually oversee them, and so they can influence those. And interpreting is the second eye. So they look at these broad frameworks and then they develop their own policy documents that interpret them according to local conditions. And that is explicitly allowed in the Chinese party system. That is one of the main ways in which the Chinese political economy has developed since the 1980s, is what Deng Xiaoping famously called crossing the river by feeling for the stones. So basically an experimental model of governance where you allow different institutions and different levels of government a certain amount of freedom to experiment within broad parameters, and you see what works, and you allow, and then you scale up the stuff that works. And then finally, rarer, but still it does happen, is the ignoring of central guidelines and policies as people pursue their own self-interest. And you might be able to do that under the cover of, for example, a contradictory policy or guideline that tells you to do two completely different things at once. So you ignore one and prioritize the other. And so what you get is this constant sort of tug of war, if you like, within the party state with different interests, different actors, different institutions pulling in different directions, which means that although there are these coordinating mechanisms and they, when the levers are pulled, they always have some kind of effect, but it's not always the effect that the central leaders wanted or intended. And the level of control is not total. So if we want to understand what China actually does on the global stage, you have to unpack these different actors in particular sectors and understand how that tug of war plays out. So just to give a very kind of illustrative example, just very, very quickly, if you take Made in China 2025, which is this big industrial policy that terrorized the world when it was announced in 2015, that's, it sets out the broad aspiration that China should become more self-sufficient in technologies, and China should not be so dependent on Western technologies. That's the broad intention. But there is no one Made in China 2025 policy document. In fact, there are over 450 different policy documents that have emerged to interpret what these broad aspirations mean and to develop, sectoral plans and subnational plans, provincial ones, sub-provincial ones for different sectors and so on. And all these different actors have interpreted what the central government wants, quote unquote, because sometimes it's not very clear exactly what in any real detail what the central government wants, according to their own interests. And what you get, therefore, is a proliferation of different kinds of projects according to local interests. And sometimes, well, quite often, in fact, it doesn't up to something very cohesive. And you get someone like Xi Jinping complaining, do we really need every single province to develop its own AI industry, to develop its own EV sector? These are just buzzwords. And so you get massive duplication, overlapping of investments, massive industrial overcapacity, and some areas shrivel, and some areas, there's a huge amount of corruption and waste as a result of these systems. And that all has real international repercussions.
I was, someone picked me up from the airport in Shanghai, a friend of a friend, in a very futuristic EV car that had all kinds of amazing bells and whistles, but it was bankrupt, the company that developed it. And the person driving, he said, well, the founder of this is a car called Hi-Fi. He said, well, they had expected they would get a bit more state support, but then the state support didn't come, right? So it was kind of, they were left to weather. And I think also you look at the car and they probably invested too much in over-engineering and trying to have all these bells and whistles on a car, which mostly should be for driving. And it was kind of just a very interesting story that he told. But I wanted to say too that, is that not also the case, what you said about Made in China 2025, that also reflects how the Belt and Road Initiative developed as well? It was exactly the same, where it was multiple different things that have come together. And as I understand it, and this kind of suggests the same for Made in China 2025, is it not that much of what comes as a post hoc rationalization from the central government about what is already happening on the ground, in the sense of there are already Chinese companies and entrepreneurs and provincial governments and municipal governments and all just doing these different things, both within China, across China, internationally, going out and, bidding for contracts to build bridges and railways and roads, and they're investing in factories in China. I mean, isn't it just an opportunity, or the efforts on the part of the central government to legitimize its authority by saying, oh, look, we've had this great plan, and they put this sort of name on these things that are already burgeoning from the ingenuity of Chinese entrepreneurs or the self-interests of Chinese actors from
Yeah.
the state to private.
There is an element of that, but then we shouldn't underestimate how impactful it can be for the state to then accept, acknowledge, and then scale up these activities. So if you take the BRI, well, you even go back even further to China's going out policy, by which the central government actively encouraged and supported state-owned enterprises and indeed private companies to internationalize. Well, that was actually trailblazed by the state-owned oil companies in the 1990s because domestic supplies of oil and gas had dried up and they needed to develop new sources, and that meant going overseas. And that is a general pattern that the saturation of markets or the exhaustion of domestic opportunities leads well-resourced Chinese firms to desperately seek markets overseas. And they often do that in advance of any clear steer from the government. Government then sees what's happening. Maybe they're lobbied, right? So this is the influencing dynamic that I mentioned earlier on. So they push, or provinces push, or whoever pushes the central government to say, look, there's a significant issue here. We want to do this. We need some support. Create the regulations, create the laws, and above all else, devote money to this. And then the government creates a sort of broad plan, and then others then take that and run with it, interpret it, / ignore it, etc. So this is how these things generally work in terms of the sequencing. But then if the central government has then devoted resources, then that can lead to then a big scaling up of activity. So with the BRI was basically slapping a new label on stuff that was already happening. And initially it was just meant to be, a bit of scaling up of activity in China's neighboring countries. It was meant to be what they call peripheral countries, which means the countries in China's periphery. So about 60 countries would have more. And this is why did this happen? Because of the exhaustion of China's post-2008 stimulus program, meant that there was basically slower growth because of the slowdown in the West leading to a slowdown in China's exports. Meant that you had massive industrial overcapacity in infrastructure-related sectors like steel, glass, aluminium, concrete, and the construction companies. So they'd splurged lots of money on construction and infrastructure, both before and especially after the GFC, and the market was completely saturated. So if we're not going to suffer significant economic dislocation, we have to externalize that capacity. And we've also accumulated trillions of dollars of foreign exchange reserves after running decades of export surpluses with the West. And that money is basically being wasted buying US Treasury bonds at close to negative interest. So we could maybe put that money to better use as well by loaning it out. And then the developing countries can borrow from us. They can use our firms and they get development and we get contracts. So win-win. And we make interest on our money. And that created a very permissive environment for everybody to pile in. So I studied this very closely with Jinghang Zhang. We wrote a paper in Third World Quarterly on this, and you could see the way that subnational governments were scrambling to get on board and shape this emerging policy document and get their names and their preferred projects into the policy document, so that then they would be able to run off and use resources to fund their state-owned enterprises and their state-linked companies to do stuff. And other countries got in and they also lobbied because they wanted part of this as well. So what started off as a little sort of new label for basically what China was already doing in its near abroad and a bit of scaling up, just ballooned into this global initiative, which it was open then to everybody. Even the United States could join the Beltandroadinitiative if it wanted to. And there was never any clear sense of what was it for, what was it supposed to achieve. There was no official map of the BRI. Unofficial maps were banned by the government in 2017 because they didn't like this idea that there was some sinister top-down plan to, link China with the world and, all these different bits somehow linked together in some grand strategy. There was no grand strategy. It was very much about negotiating bilateral deals with the individual countries. And often the projects that were being loaded into those deals were pioneered by state-owned enterprises that were just sniffing around for contracts in developing countries and then aggregated into a bilateral agreement because governments love to sign these deals on international visits, and it all then it acquires the appearance of some top-down grand strategy. But the moment that you start to pick at it and investigate the detail, it's very much about bottom-up, market-driven interests on the part, particularly of Chinese state-owned enterprises.
I think this is really fascinating because what you've described with the Made in China 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative, is, state-owned enterprises, different actors lobbying to advance their interests. How different is what China's doing than how it works in the United States or in Western Europe, where, in the United States, there's not big state-owned enterprises, but there's plenty of lobbying.
Yeah.
That's kind of how Washington works. And some would even say the U.S. is a very mercantilist country.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as liberal as people think it is. So how is what happens in China different than American companies or European companies going abroad? What's different about the Chinese system? And because I want to get, again, China's always held up as this very different, it's driven by this party state. It's command and control. It's Xi Jinping goes and gives a speech and then everyone reads it and follows that. But what you've said is actually, there's a lot of dynamism and a lot of backroom deals that are no different than what you see in most Western countries. How is China different?
So I think when Xi Jinping gives a speech these days, it's true that everybody reads it and comments on it and has to do some kind of, sycophantic group study, the great wisdom of Xi Jinping as party center and all the rest of it. But as I said, does it give you clear guidance and say, does it give you clear guidance to stop doing X and start doing Y? It probably doesn't. It just says you should do X and Y, even though they're mutually incompatible. And then it's left to you to work out, well, what the hell does that mean for me and how are we going to try and square this circle? That hasn't changed. So the model as I sketch it out is not different under Xi Jinping. What difference he has made is he is a very forceful player of the game. So he has deployed all of the coordinating mechanisms, creating new coordinating bodies, leading small groups or party commissions, forcefully using the systems of appointment, appraisal, and especially discipline, right? So the anti-corruption crackdowns, the purging of loads of cadres, tighter control over budget and laws, etc. It's just he's pulled on all those levers at once, which has affected the way that the system works, but it doesn't mean that he is micromanaging and controlling everything, because many of the problems that arise from this kind of experimental system, which does grant a great deal of autonomy, still persist. So you still have local governments that are investing in stuff that the central government doesn't want them to invest in, that they are still running big deficits and spending on stuff that they shouldn't be, and that there is still massive surplus capacity and an overlapping, duplicating investments, for example. So even though all these coordinating mechanisms have a result, they don't necessarily have the desired result. And one perverse result of all this pulling on the levers is the system starts to become much more concerned about getting it wrong. So because the top level guidance remains still quite vague, but the costs for getting it wrong, and that is often only revealed in a post hoc way, the costs have risen because you could be arrested, purged, even executed. Lots of people now in the system, party cadres or state cadres, are now much more nervous about experimenting. And lots of people have pointed to sort of bureaucratic inertia building up and a lack of dynamism in the political economy as a result, because state officials are too worried. So that's the risk when you start kind of clamping down on a system like that, is that experimental dynamism starts to fade away. And I think that feeds through into lower growth rates. There are, of course, other causes to that. But to get back to your question about what is different, I mean, clearly the fact that it's a one-party state matters. The reason why American companies spend so much on lobbying is because laws and budgets are determined in Congress, and that's not really the case with China, with the National People's Congress, right? There is debate, and there is, I think, some serious development of policy making does happen through the NPC, but that's not the main power center in the Chinese system. It's much more based on a sort of personal networks than it is based on lobbying particular so-called representatives, which obviously aren't actually representative in the Chinese system. The fact that you've got, I mean, if you took away the Communist Party and you just had the state system as it works, as it's configured, it would be really incoherent. And it would be really messy, and lots of people just not complying with things. The Communist Party is the main factor of cohesion within the Chinese-style regulatory state. And I think that has particular consequences for the way that people interpret the behaviour of Chinese actors overseas, because the most prominent actors are often state-owned enterprises. And so there is always this constant suspicion that what these entities are doing is they're acting as arms of the party state. They're pawns being moved on the chessboard by the central government. Now, what I've tried to do in my work is to say the story is a lot more complicated than that, right? They have their own interests, they have their own agendas, and you can explain what they're doing perfectly well with reference to those. And often they do things that the party centre do not want them to do. So when they get involved in these overseas scandals, like, crappy white elephant projects or massive corruption scandals or environmental disasters or the mistreatment of local populations, all of these things are against Chinese rules and regulations, right? This is an example of ignoring, and it often leads to significant societal blowback against the Chinese government and sometimes to significant damage to the bilateral relationship, which the Chinese government absolutely doesn't want. But because oversight and control is so limited, and fragmented in many ways, those things do unfortunately happen. But you can never totally eliminate the suspicion that the reason why state-owned enterprise X is doing Y in country Z is because Xi Jinping has called up the chairman and said, I want you to go and build that port in that country. You can never totally eliminate that suspicion.
Right.
And if Xi Jinping did do that, there's absolutely no way the chairman could refuse.
Right. No,
whereas it is possible for an American company to refuse to do what the American government says, right, in an informal way.
So, don't get me wrong. People are thinking that I'm trying to say that America and the West or China is no different than us. But I guess the way to frame it is that the form is different. It's not a representative democracy. It's a one-party state. But often at the functional level, how things function, you can find lots of different similarities. And what you're saying is, in many respects, the functions of how people are doing business, how they're getting things done and interacting with the local government officials or regional government official, provincial level, is not so different than how a New York property developer would build a building and build a golf course, right? There's a lot of interactions, with different levels of government and, getting different financiers involved. And so how is it so different in China?
There are elements of the business, just doing business, I suppose, that have some kind of similarity. But there is another important difference, which is the non-independence of the judiciary. Again, you can raise the question about how far is this still true in a country like the United States, right? As you can ask that question about levels of democracy and autocratization and all the rest of it. But still, there is some signs of life in the American judiciary in the way that there certainly isn't in Congress. Whereas you're not going to get, if you're a Western company trying to sue a Chinese company in China these days, you are not going to get a ruling that favors you. 9 times out of 10, the Chinese company will come out on top, or 99 times out of 100, right? This is a serious difference, I think, right? There is not, the Western tradition of rule of law simply doesn't exist in China. It's more like rule by law, right? They want a law-governed society, so they're increasingly developing laws and rules and regulations that formalize what were only previously informal rules and mechanisms. But that, for them, that's to extend party-state control. It's not to extend kind of predictability and stability in the market and that kind of thing. It's not to allow foreigners to challenge what the CCP wants to do or anything like that. So I do think there are very significant differences, but there are also significant similarities. And so the way that we see it is that a regulatory statehood, the move towards that, has been quite general across the world. And so the thing to understand is not, how weird China is, right? And to understand it as a kind of standalone sui generis model, which is the way a lot of people who work on China do approach it. Because they only look at China. They're just sinologists. And so they just describe the way China works as if it's completely unique. And for our money, it's not. So there's decades of work going back on this stuff. The fragmented authoritarianism literature that emerged at the end of the 1980s. And some people would look at our work and say, well, you're not saying anything new compared to that literature. But what we are trying to do, as well as extending it beyond just talking about fragmentation, talking also about the internationalization of the party state, is to put this in its global context. There's a reason why China has moved in this direction, which is engagement with globalization and the move towards the market. And we can theorize what's going on using tools from state theory, because these similar kinds of dynamics can be seen in other countries. So it's not to say it's basically exactly the same as everywhere else, but neither are we saying, this is a unique model that requires, unique concepts. We want to try to develop a framework that you could potentially apply to lots of different countries. And in fact, the framework has been applied to many other kind of so-called rising powers as well. So that's the aspiration.
No, I mean, I think I agree wholeheartedly. I think it's, yeah, of course, history and geography matters, context matters, but the whole point of science and social science is to be able to compare across cases, and comparison is about looking for similarities and differences, and often you find lots of similarities.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just focus on, and I agree with you too, is when you read those cases where it's just about China, and I'm frequently asked to review papers about state capitalism. And if they're a paper that's just about China and they'll say, China's a state capitalist economy, I say, well, so what?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that? How do you compare it to other countries? It's not very interesting to say that, oh, the state's active. It's like, well, I can show you the state's active in a lot of different countries. And this is normal capitalist state activity. But I want to talk more about the authoritarian aspect. So what is driving the anxiety in the West, and how much of that is legitimate and how much of that is just hyperbole? How much of that is an excuse to justify protectionism of one's own industries or geopolitical interests? And what is it a legitimate concern around Chinese authoritarianism? And those examples you gave around, we don't never know if the state-owned enterprise that's investing in country X is doing so for political reasons, right? I mean, we can say it's always an empirical question. I mean, I don't think a state entity is necessarily political. It has to have, you have plenty of sovereign wealth funds or state-owned enterprises that are just doing business. Whether it's being driven by politics is an empirical question.
Mm-hmm.
Notwithstanding, like you say, Chinese judiciary is not independent, and 9 out of 10 times if a foreign company is involved, it's going to lose. Or if there's an investment abroad, you don't know if there's the politics, whereas typically international economic relations among private firms in the West is not driven by politics. So just to round my question into a simple one, how much of the authoritarianism is a concern, how much legitimate concern, how much of it is hyperbole used to justify particular statist response, I would say,
It's a very good question, and I think the answer has to be quite a complex one. So I think it's important to set all this in the wider context, where if we kind of rewind to the so-called end of history moment in 1989, when the Soviet Union, the Cold War ended, and then subsequently the Soviet Union imploded, leaving liberalism supposedly as the terminal point of mankind's ideological evolution. The idea that took hold in the West was essentially one of liberal triumphalism, that everybody will eventually become like us. Even China would become more liberal, and that's how the people that wanted to engage with China in the early 1980s, particularly the business lobby, convinced and won over or rather triumphed over the sort of anti-China security hawks and the sort of liberal interventionists who wanted to really double down on the sanctions that had been imposed on China after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. Was that the way that we sort of continue to ensure that China follows the arc of history, which is towards liberalism, is we engage with them and then they'll become more like us. Now, how far people ever really believed that, or they convinced themselves that it was true, and how much it was cynical, is open to interpretation. But nonetheless, the vibes of the time were clearly that, liberalism was in the ascendant, our model is the best, and everybody else is going to be scrambling to catch up. And the 1990s and the early 2000s were this kind of peak period where the West was basically trying to push this model on everybody else through whether it's IMF shock therapy or structural adjustment, aid programs, military intervention at the pointy end of things, through funding civil society and all the rest of it. And I think authoritarian regimes were very much on the back foot at that time. But then 2008, I think, was a major turning point. There were many missteps in the run up to that, not least the Iraq War, for example. But 2008, I think, it really marked a structural break in Western economies' economic performance towards long-term stagnation. Various inequalities that had been building up really exploded. A sort of anti-globalist backlash, particularly centered around immigration, long-term unemployment, sense that people have been shut out politically and economically in the rise of populist challenges. And then you start to get this kind of different view of countries like China, which was not entirely new, because even in the 90s, you had people like Tony Blair were huge admirers of Singapore for example, as being this, quasi-authoritarian regime that just got things done, and didn't have to mess around with democracy and pacifying interest groups, and didn't have to worry what was in the Daily Mail and that kind of thing. And, this sort of longing, a kind of secret admiration and fantasy that, oh, I wish we could, run out a country like that. And then, China was the state that it basically appeared to escape the impact of the global financial crisis. Its economy kept growing, massive stimulus package, continuous rapid economic expansion, okay, at a slow rate, but still accounted for the vast lion's share of all poverty reduction in the world. And it looked like authoritarianism was delivering the goods in a way that Western democracy no longer could. And so I think that context is really important, because I think liberal elites in the West these days are genuinely feeling a lot of pressure from their own populations, and they're fearful, and they don't really seem to know what they can do in
how to fix it.
How to fix it. They're kind of just like rabbits caught in the headlights. And so in that context, there is this desire to, as I said earlier on, to kind of externalize blame for the world that they actually created. Right? It's been a US-led order, and they were the ones laying down the rules. They were the ones that pushed globalization. They were the ones that decided to deregulate everything and enable offshoring. They were the ones that, rampaged around trying to spread freedom and democracy at the point of a gun. This is the world that they made. But they'd rather sort of say, oh, well, it was all fine until these nasty revisionist states started messing it up.
Just as one caveat or one interjection is, I want to defend the classical liberals, like the person behind me, Adam Smith, who was not a liberal internationalist. If you read of the work of Smith, he treats other countries, other nations as being perfectly fine in continuing their particular civilizational way of life. He was not, nor can you find in his work, evidence that you would see any sense of liberal internationalism that we saw in the 20th century around trying to spread democracy. And like, of course, you read the work of Smith, and he thinks trade is good. He thinks markets have a place in terms of creating more prosperity and efficiency. That's fine. But he was never of the like that thought, well, China needs to become like, Chinese civilization needs to become like Western civilizations to underpin trade. I mean, he thought, well, you can have two different kinds of economies or groups of nations trading, but you don't have to force your particular way of life on that. So I just wanted to put that kind of defense of
that's fair enough.
Classical liberalism,
I mean, there's John Stuart Mill's famous essay on intervention, which is an essay against interventionism, to say if there's no way that countries that are forced to be free from the outside will maintain liberty. And I think he's right about that as an empirical claim. And of course, the principle of non-intervention, sovereignty, and national self-determination are classical liberal principles. So this is about liberalism in practice as a kind of governing ideology, which is in practice a kind of fusion of liberal principles, perhaps with, US exceptionalism and US-style evangelism, the idea that the United States is a city on the hill that, has to bring the light of freedom to the rest of the world, and that's how you make yourself safe as well, that you must spread democracy in order to make yourself totally secure. That's the sort of American, that's what I mean when I talk about liberalism in the post-Cold War context. I'm not talking about what Adam Smith or J.S. Mill.
No. I think I just wanted to mention that for listeners that are thinking, oh, this is what liberalism means.
It's a totally fair enough. It's a totally fair point. And maybe just to round out the point about authoritarianism, I think it's undoubtedly true that after Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, the regime did become more authoritarian. Before that, under Jiang Zemin and then Hu Jintao, the regime had become not liberal, but it had allowed some grassroots elections. It allowed more space for kind of freedom of speech. And through this sort of Chinese-style regulatory state, it created quite a lot of freedom and autonomy for different groups. But within that had also created a great deal of disorder, chaos, discontent, and massive levels of corruption, land grabbing, that kind of stuff. By the late Hu period, you had clearly Communist Party elites worried that this was doing permanent damage to the legitimacy of the regime and its long-term survival. And so there needed to be a course correction, and this is why they installed Xi Jinping to enact this course correction and bring about greater discipline. And the result has been a much more authoritarian climate that also manifests in domestic crackdowns on areas that are seen as weak points. Hong Kong, particularly Xinjiang, but that's not a new issue. That's not entirely related to him. But so I think there has been a more authoritarian tenor to Chinese politics. There's no doubt about that. And this is my point about, when the first question that you asked me about what does China want, and it kind of ignores the fact that it's done those things because it just doesn't think it's anybody else's business. When the West looks at that contributes to this sense in the West that we were wrong. This idea of this expanding zone of freedom, that China was eventually going to become like us. Well, Xi Jinping is a decisive slap in the face to anybody that still thought that.
But the bigger question, though, considering that Chinese economic growth is fairly moribund at the moment, and that was the observation I made just being in China and conversations I had with various people, was that the economy wasn't firing on all cylinders. And the question then is that in part due to the, let's call it what it is, the more authoritarian crackdown on the part of Xi to consolidate his own power? And on the one hand, yes, he wants to create more stability and not have, control corruption and the like, but at what cost? And how sustainable is that if growth needs more dynamism, more experimentation?
Yeah, I do think that the sort of tightening leash, the way that Xi Jinping has activated these coordinating mechanisms and reduced the space for experimentation, does play a role in explaining the slowdown in the Chinese economy. I do think that there are other reasons. It is just very difficult to sustain 10 or even 5% growth rates indefinitely. The fact that they did it for 20 years is unprecedented in human history, and especially for an economy the size of China's. There comes a point where I think it just becomes unsustainable anyway, but and in particular because the low-hanging fruits have kind of been harvested. So China is rapidly industrialized, it's rapidly improved its agriculture, and it's started to move up the value-added chain by hook or by crook. And then it faces a similar problem to a lot of developing countries, which is the middle-income trap, where it becomes much harder to develop out of that, low to middle value-added space. It's done very well in many respects, and it is still striving. This is what Made in China 2025 is really about, is getting out of that middle-income trap into higher value-added technological production, not being dependent forever on the technology of the West and of Japan, which everybody in middle-income countries wants to achieve. And if anybody can do it, it will be the Chinese. And I think it probably requires the kinds of forceful intervention, subsidization, trade policies, etc. It can't happen through mere market mechanisms or even soft interventions. That's the record of most developing countries, it seems to me. But then there's also just global conditions. I mean, in the end, China is still quite dependent on its export-oriented industrial economy, and global demand on the part of the advanced economies has declined because of the long-term economic slump and stagnation in the West. How do you maintain growth if your main export markets are, first of all, experiencing stagnation, and secondly, becoming more hostile towards you and starting to impose tariffs on you? And so there's a desperate search at the moment for an alternative set of markets, and they're thinking of the global South. And this will also have repercussions for China's international standing, because the way that China's trying to address the stagnation that you saw and that people were talking to you about in China, growth rates maybe running at 2% per year, which is nowhere near sufficient to sort of pacify Chinese society in the long haul, it seems to me, let alone rival the United States in the long term. They've really tried to ramp up export-oriented manufacturing. So there's been a massive surge in that over the past couple of years to keep growth rates up. But now they're struggling to find markets in the West. So that stuff is now being pushed into the global South. And there's already been lots of work suggesting that China's rise as a manufacturing superpower has contributed to the premature deindustrialization of many countries in the global south. And the China shock, the second kind of China shock, I think, is about to hit the global south because you just cannot compete with Chinese exports. And as already you're starting to see countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, others start to erect tariff walls against Chinese goods in a desperate attempt to protect their own local manufacturers.
And it doesn't seem that, and this is what the U.S. would love, is for China to become more of a consumer-oriented economy and rebalance its growth. But there doesn't seem to be any interest at the top to do that, or they don't know how to do that. They still, as you've said, they've doubled down on the export-led growth model. And now that's having consequences outside of the advanced economies in the global south. And that's going to create more problems for China's standing on the world stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's round off our conversation with regards to where does the UK we've talked a bit about America, or a lot about the United States and China. You've mentioned the global south, been some mention of China's close neighbors. Where's the UK and Europe in all of this?
Well, to some extent, they're caught in the middle. And to some extent, they're on one side, which is obviously the American side. Mm-hmm. So broadly speaking, the Americans are much more hawkish and aggressive towards the Chinese than the Europeans are. And that hawkishness, you could see it start to change a little bit under Obama with the pivot to Asia in 2009. But it really started with the first Trump administration. And then the Biden administration basically took on Trump's China policy and actually dialed it up to 11. And then, with Trump, it's not quite clear what his China policy is. And I still think that bizarrely, he seems to think that he can get some kind of grand deal out of China, and the negotiations are ongoing. But I think if he is to get a deal, that is not just about trade. Basically a grand bargain that settles all of the strategic issues between the United States and China. If it's just about trade, then Xi Jinping will sign a deal that says, okay, you can have TikTok and we'll buy your semiconductors and you can buy our stuff and fine. We can just go back to the way that things used to be. That's fine. But the United States would have to lift things like tech embargoes and stop meddling in Taiwan and all the rest of it. And for the United States to do that would be a complete about face on US policy towards Asia for decades. So it would really mean effectively abandoning the goal of US strategic primacy in East Asia. And it's not clear that Trump wants to do that or can get away with doing that just in order to secure a grand trade rebalancing. So that's still, I think, a question mark that we have to kind of watch. But broadly speaking, particularly under Biden, and particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the UK and EU were dragged into a much more anti-China position. So the United States tried to badge together Russia and China as autocracies and to rally democracies against autocracies. And you could see it. And at the time I was seconded into the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office from 2022 to 2024, advising them on policy towards Southeast Asia and China. And the policy got very aggressive and very hawkish, particularly when Liz Truss was Foreign Secretary and then Prime Minister, and then it kind of eased off a little bit. And European policy also became kind of more confrontational, right? The China-EU investment agreement, which was very heavily skewed towards the Chinese, was not ratified by the European Parliament, and the EU started to talk about de-risking and so on. And so broadly, you can see the way that the UK and EU sort of trail behind the United States. And I think the position that Europe has taken over Ukraine means that it doesn't really have any strategic autonomy left, right? It talks about strategic autonomy, but in fact, it's totally under the thumb of the United States because of its obsession with NATO and the insistence on seeing Russia as just an authoritarian threat on Europe's borders that has no justified security concerns at all. And we need the American security umbrella. And so they'll twist whatever way they can to try and get the Americans to commit to Europe. And that means that they're not really autonomous of the United States, which I think means that they can't engage in a fundamental reappraisal of what the United States means for them and how it relates to their interests. and how it relates to world order. So lots of people in the global south have long thought that the United States is a revisionist power, and it's even an imperial power, and it's threatening to world order in all kinds of ways. And lots of people would look at what's happened under the second Trump administration in particular and agree with that perspective. But European elites broadly, particularly liberal ones, I mean, some populist ones are perhaps think a bit differently, but they're not really able to, that doesn't compute in their mind. And that's what would be needed for them to develop true strategic autonomy, would be to look at the United States in the same sort of objective way that they might look at Russia and they might look at China, and they would be able to kind of think about their own interests and their own strategy towards these countries. So what we've seen since Trump returned to power and started blasting even close United States allies with threats of military aggression and tariffs is Europe has softened its position on China. So you've seen warming ties between the EU and China. I think the EU and UK are maybe just signalling just slightly to Washington that, well, if you're mean to us, well, we can kind of cozy up to China a little bit. And China, I think, is rightly trying to exploit that opportunity, although it's still quite nervous and it's not quite convinced that you can really chisel the Western powers away from the United States, but it's trying insofar as it can. But I think that movement is always going to be fundamentally limited by the sort of liberal framing of Western foreign policy. So that it's better than the position a few years ago when this sort of West versus East new Cold War framing was really at its peak. Things seem to have calmed down a little bit, but they can always flare back up again, it seems to me.
Final question. And I know you're associated with some of the work on the second Cold War Observatory at Manchester. Are we in a second Cold War?
Yes, I think we are. Our aspiration in doing the work on China, Shahar and I, was that we could see as early as 2013, when we started to put the project together, that a new Cold War was brewing. And our sort of naive aspiration was to make some kind of contribution to trying to avert that by saying, look, the way that you're thinking about China is just a bit mistaken. And so the fact that you think everything that some Chinese actor does in some third country is some grand strategy, I just don't think it is. And if we could have perhaps understand what China is and what it isn't a bit more, then we could perhaps have a more rational and reasonable debate about China. But by the time the book came out, the confrontation was in full swing. We were far too late, and obviously wouldn't have made that much difference anyway, right? But so I think to some extent it's kind of baked in, and I think
what would it take then to de-escalate? In my view, and again, I just think no one benefits. And ultimately, I think if we want to have more global prosperity, we need to de-escalate. How do we do that? That's the final question. Maybe that's not a fair question to ask at the very end of a podcast.
I think it's really difficult because I think fundamentally the view that the Chinese have of the United States is that eventually the United States will turn on China and attack it and try to suppress it. And they thought that there was a window of opportunity for China to develop, to grow, so that it would be able to withstand the onslaught when it came. And I think they have good reason to think that this is the way that the United States will behave and the way that hegemonic powers often behave. So they would look, for example, at what the Americans did to Japan in the 1980s, when Japan was described in the United States in the same way that China is today, that it's
I
cheating,
remember.
This is where Donald Trump first started to make his calls for tariffs.
Yeah.
Japan is an ally, and the Americans hammered Japan economically, and that didn't cause the sort of breaking of the Japanese economy directly, but it definitely dented Japan's economic trajectory, and it resulted in the reassertion of America's industrial and military primacy. This time, the enemy state, the one that's rising and getting closer to the United States, it's an enemy state, right? It's not within the US alliance system. It can't be so easily disciplined. So they think, well, eventually it was going to happen anyway. And what has happened, I think, is that window of opportunity is drastically shortened. And it's in part because of what China's done itself, the things I've been talking about in terms of its domestic crackdowns and its greater international assertiveness, right? It would never view it in that way. But actually, I think it has, Susan Shirk has argued, right? Xi Jinping has engaged in dramatic overreach and I think has suffered the consequences of that. But a lot of this, I think, is internally driven within the United States and within the West. The United States cannot tolerate threats to its primacy. I think that the pattern is clear. So whoever gets near to America's to kind of threatening American primacy, that's just viewed as totally beyond the pale. The idea that the United States should accept its relative decline into one great power among many, it sits very badly with the ruling ideology of the American ruling class and with actually much of the Western establishment as well, right? They don't really want to see the United States decline into just another big power, right? Wants to be dominated by the United States, right? American empire in Europe is an empire by invitation. The Europeans don't really want to step up and become an independent pole in world affairs, despite whatever they say. Their revealed behavior is that, they do whatever they can to appease Trump. And then when the Republicans go out of power and normal service is resumed under a more globalist, internationalist Democrat president, they breathe a sigh of relief, right? This happened with George Bush in the 2000s. Obama came back in, everybody, yeah, great, And then the same with when Trump went away. Biden, yeah, great, Yeah. And it's the same kind of pattern, right? So the Europeans also don't want to see a hegemony dethroned. And I think that's what basically it would take to really avoid a kind of structured and structural confrontation to get out of that. You'd have to have a real sea change of mindset in the West to accept that there are different systems that we don't particularly like them, but we have to deal with them and we might have to share power with them. And that is just not the way that these states think and are accustomed to thinking. They've had decades where they've got no reason to think, why should we think like that, right? The years of US unipolarity has created a mindset and a framework that is very difficult for them to get rid of. Is it possible to manage the relationship so that it doesn't boil over into direct conflict? Yes, because that was achieved during the Cold War, at least at the level of great power relations. But obviously there was tremendous violence and struggle and conflict in the developing world. And that's what, the Global South is terrified of something like this happening again. This is why they say no to a new Cold War. And I think that is perhaps one of the key differences this time round. Is there are a number of key differences. One is this is happening within globalized capitalism. This is not communism versus capitalism. China is a state within globalized capitalism, and the new Cold War can be seen as a contradiction within that. Right? It's contradictions arising within the American political economy, resulting from globalization, that brings someone like Trump to power, and then makes Biden think you have to have a foreign policy for the middle class, and so on. That's one big difference. And another big difference is the change of conditions in the Global South. So in the Global South, in the context of genuinely revolutionary times, and a choice between right and left, between capitalism and communism, and these states were emerging from European imperialism, and they faced a fateful choice, right? What model are we going to adopt? What are we going to choose? And there is no such revolutionary and counter-revolutionary struggle today. And consequently, developing countries don't have to get so caught up in great power conflict, because their domestic conflicts don't map onto a sort of ideological and geopolitical rivalry at the global level. In very few countries is that the case. And so what they want is to remain what we call polyaligned, right? Is to say we want as many relationships with as many different partners as possible to maximize our own benefit. And we say no to a new Cold War. We say no to the invasion of Ukraine, broadly speaking, but we don't want to engage in an endless crusade against Russia. And we don't want to be dragged into the side of the West. And we don't want to be dragged into the side of China, right? We just want to be on our own side for our own benefit. And I think that pushback, particularly at the time of the sort of Biden offensive after the invasion of Ukraine, was significant in moderating the approach of Western states, right? I saw it myself from inside government, like the pushback from the Global South to say, no, we're not interested. Don't come and lecture us on sovereignty and non-intervention, given your own record, right? And we don't want to buy into this, right? We just settle your conflicts, right? We don't want to buy into this new struggle. Those are all moderating factors. That means that we don't have to, and in fact, it's very difficult to go back to an old world order defined by exclusive economic blocks, because this is all happening within globalization. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to see a decades-long struggle for supremacy and conflict over, who's got who's got which ally in the global south, and whose systems are going to be used, whose technology standards are going to rule, whose financial systems are going to be dominant, whose currency. We are back in that much more contested, geopolitically fractious age, and the conflict between China and the West does seem to be a structural one that is not possible to just simply diffuse. But we'll see over the next few years whether I'm right or wrong. Maybe Trump pulls this deal out of his hat and says, you can have Taiwan. We don't really care about East Asia anymore. Do what you like. You can have your own sphere of influence. That's what some people are suggesting. My own view is that's not the way that Trump thinks. He's still projecting power internationally. Look at what he's doing in the Middle East. It's this kind of bonkers peace plan for the Palestinians. This is not somebody that's retreating to a hemispheric role where the United States has its sphere of influence and the Russians have theirs and the Chinese have theirs. It's not that. It's something much more fuzzy and ad hoc, but coupled still, I think, with a deep addiction to the notion of American primacy, to dollar hegemony, to the United States as the indispensable power that everybody else should defer to and respect. And in that sense, I think they would view any rising power as a dangerous threat to the United States, and one that has to be contained and disciplined.
On that note, Lee Jones, thanks for being on the New Enlightenment podcast.
That's my pleasure.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.